Hey everybody, and thank you very much for tuning in to the very first podcast of Candlelight University, your one-stop podcast for everything strange and unexplainable. So sit back and grab yourself a cold drink and make yourself a tinfoil hat, because today we're diving into shadow people. Here with your host Vic Whaley.
And Marcus D. A little bit of background information about your hosts here. My name is Marcus D. I've worked in the social work field and mental health field for about 5 years now, and I hear a lot of strange and unusual stories from people. I consider myself a skeptic but still a spiritual person. But as the years roll by, it's getting harder and harder to just write off every story that I hear.
Like I said before, my name's Vic Whaley. I came from a small farming town. It was steeped with its own mysteries and folklore, and I often found myself searching those out. Honestly, not much changed too much. I love diving into a good investigation and often find myself knee-deep in one. I see myself as a bit of a truth seeker. Most people see me as a bit of a kook, but I wouldn't have it any other way.
And this love for paranormal has led me and Vic to the founding members of the One Candle Society. We're a paranormal investigation group that goes out and investigates the strange and unusual here in Evansville, Indiana, and the surrounding areas. Most of the time when people have these strange and unusual stories, no one's listening. Well, we do. And we go out and we try to help people the best we can. Sometimes it's through trying to help them deal with the strange and unusual. Sometimes it's just listening. Sometimes it's just helping them share their story. And well, anybody that's been through Evansville, Indiana knows sometimes there's not much to see here. So that's why we're doing this podcast, is we want to get our message out there and maybe have some people out there give us a message or two.
This podcast is going to be devoted to all things strange and unusual. We're going to be hitting issues like shadow people, which is what we're discussing today, but we'll also be hitting things like UFOs, aliens, extra-dimensional beings. Pretty much going to go for it all. As long as you guys are willing to listen, we'll keep talking.
Our research today on shadow people has us pulling from a couple different sources. Some first-hand accounts with some people, the internet, but a lot of our research is coming from a book called Darkness Walks, The Shadow People Among Us, written by Jason Offit. Jason is a writer and he's a college journalist and professor. And throughout most of this guy's life, with all of the jobs that this guy's had, there's no way he could not walk away with so many stories. This guy's been a reporter, a bartender, a photographer, a farmhand, and a small Midwestern town mayor.
I've often found that people who get mixed up in this sort of work ends up coming from jobs where they deal a lot with people face to face. Why do you think that is, Marcus?
Well, a lot of times when people get these stories, they want to share them with people. You know, they want people to know and hear about what they've seen. You know, and they just want to try to make some sort of sense of it. And these jobs that Jason's had, that's kind of what they do, is they make you have to try to help people through hearing these stories. And by collecting these stories, he's been able to give us great books such as Ghost Hunting Missouri, Darkness Walks, of course, and the newest addition to my Amazon wish list, How to Kill Monsters Using Common Household Items, a must-have home defense guide for the do-it-yourself slayer.
I really don't want to know what you're going to end up doing with that.
Hey, if the Democrats get their way and impose harsher gun laws, you're going to want to kind of have to come up with a new way to defend your home in case you're attacked by an army of gnomes.
Well, I've always been a big fan of improvisation, so I'll have to grab myself a copy of it.
Through his work, Jason has helped several people share their stories in the hope that they understand, as he says in his words, you're not alone anymore. So, what did you think of the book, Vic?
Well, it was clearly well written, well researched. I greatly enjoyed it. And if you want to have some ideas of theories on what shadow people might be, it's a good read. But you gotta be able to sit through a great, vast wealth of interviews. The vast majority of the book is a series of stories that he's collected, and I suggest taking your time and breaking it up. If you try to do it all in one setting like I did, your eyes are going to start to bleed.
Yeah, but I think you kind of need that with a book on the paranormal, because, you know, as a skeptic myself, something that we say a lot is that there is just not enough research on a lot of these subjects. And what Darkness Walks does is it collects so many of these stories together that you can sort of start seeing parallels from other people's stories, and it it begs the question: is there something to them?
Well, it does give you enough information that you can start creating your own theories on what they might be, what their goals are, and things along those lines. And the book does that very, very well. But take it from me, go in bite-sized chunks.
But that's a good point, Vic. Trying to kind of figure out what these things are. So Vic, what are shadow people?
Well, the most simple way of describing it is they are a human shadow that has no natural reason to be there. They can be opaque or transparent, they can be freestanding, or moving more like a shadow would in a two-dimensional fashion along a wall.
So, kind of like the name suggests.
Yep.
Yeah. I was really happy that we picked shadow people because it is an entity that a lot of people describe as some of their very first encounters with the paranormal.
In interviews that I've had, shadow people are one of the most common reported things.
Jason himself, when you read the book, he describes, seeing some himself when he was younger.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some encounters with shadow people like? Like what are some of the commonalities that you'll see?
Well, encounters with shadow people can vary a great deal.
Uh-huh.
Some of them are mostly benign, where you run into one just seem like it may be going around its day-to-day business. You may run into one where it seems to be locked into a loop, repeating the same sort of functions over and over again. But they can also go a more sinister route. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, not being able to move, and seeing something on the other side of the room that you can't quite explain, like a shadow person.
You talking about sleep paralysis a little bit?
Yep. Shadow people sightings are very highly associated with sleep paralysis, although not exclusive to them.
So what is sleep paralysis, Vic?
Well, there's a switch in the brain that shuts off your ability to move while you're dreaming. That's why when you go on your little adventures in your dreams throughout the night, you don't bang yourself up in your bed, twisting and squirming around. Sometimes that switch doesn't fully switch off when you wake up. And you find yourself locked in a state where you're conscious, but you can't move.
It's kind of the reverse of sleepwalking, in which you're able to move around, but you're just not conscious of what you're doing.
That'd be a good way of explaining it.
I don't know. Sleep paralysis is a very, very disturbing concept to me. I think losing the ability to move in the face of something,
That feeling of being ultimately vulnerable.
and helpless, which is a trait that a lot of people describe whenever they encounter with shadow people sometimes.
Yep.
Um,
So some of the encounters can be very disturbing. Other people will find themselves stalked throughout their life by shadow people. Sometimes they'll just run into them once, and sometimes they can take on a variety of different aspects. Some of them will appear unnaturally gaunt. Sometimes they'll have certain normal characteristics amplified, like hands being abnormally large or fingers being abnormally long. You can even see traits like red eyes or clothing traits.
and it doesn't. And shadow people doesn't always just mean shadow people. A lot of times, some people even see them as animals too.
Yep, it's not uncommon for people to spot shadow animals as well. It brings in an interesting connection to a creature called the Bargeist, which is usually described in folklore as a solid black wolf or dog-like creature with glowing red eyes.
Mhm.
Usually a omen of ill things to come.
Yeah, that was something that when I was reading Darkness Walks that they talked a lot about, was that sometimes when people see shadow people as omens to things, a lot of times is not necessarily good things. I remember a story in there which describes a person that was seeing a shadow person outside of their house, and the following morning a neighbor across the street had died.
Yeah, I recall that one as well. It's not terribly uncommon for shadow people to be seen as omens, but to the average person who happens to see one, I'd say it's probably just you happen to cross one. But there does seem to be a correlation there, although I've never found one personally in my own investigations.
Yeah, one of the things that Darkness Walks talked about, which I thought was interesting, was when you see shadow people, a lot of times they talk about hearing a buzzing sound, kind of described like a hive of bees or a swarm of bees. And I thought that was really interesting because that kind of made them sound a lot like ghosts. 'Cause a lot of ghost hunters, they describe that you hear buzzing sounds a lot of times when you see these things. They describe it as like the air vibrating relatively quickly, maybe being like a higher energy level in the area.
I've also heard the theory that that buzzing sound is the sound of them drawing in ambient energy to give them the power to manifest. That they're always around. It's just being able to be seen requires drawing a little extra energy from the surroundings. There's also the theory that they're extra dimensional, and that's the sound of them trying to pull through.
Um, then you also have the people that believe that they might be a demonic entity. A lot of times, whenever people seem to be describing shadow people, one of the things they talk about is this just innate fear. This innate, just when you're looking at it, that it freezes you with fear. Even if you're not sleeping, like you're just walking outside and you encounter one. And religious paranormal investigators will say that, well, that's a sign possible of demonic activity, because we're innately aware of this thing being an evil entity, and it's our own subconscious trying to tell us that we should be wary or be scared.
Like a primordial or instinctual fear.
Exactly.
This brings in an interesting connection to black-eyed kids. If you're not aware of it, I highly suggest you go out and look it up. But black-eyed kids are often associated with driving in a powerful, unnatural, deep-seated fear in the people who are around them, even before they notice that there's anything strange about the child, like their overarching black eyes. They'll just know this person is dangerous, even though it looks like a child. This is something that I should fear.
We talked about black eyes, but a lot of times with shadow people, some people will, when they describe encounters with them, is the biggest thing they describe are these giant, glowing red eyes that they have.
That's true. Red-eyed shadow people are not the most common reported thing, but they are out there. And most of the time, with involving red-eyed shadow people, they're usually more vicious or even more obsessed, taking on an almost stalker-like sort of aspect.
Yeah, when I was reading these, a person's relationship with a shadow person is a lot like being in a relationship with an abuser, like a domestic violence relationship type thing. You know, when people are seeing shadow people, a lot of times they're by themselves. There are stories of people where they're with more than one person, but a lot of times you're seeing shadow people when you're by yourself, which is a trait that abusers like to do, where they isolate their victims. Then again, we also talked about that innate fear, that intimidating feeling that you see.
What other connections can you draw between shadow people and domestic violence situations?
A lot of times they end up with people, the victim often resorting to negative coping skills in order to handle with the situation. A lot of times victims of domestic violence are much more likely to use drugs. They're much more likely to have poor sleep hygiene. They're more likely to become ostracized from their families because of their relationships with these things.
Interesting stuff to mull over. Think that might be a good spot to take our first break? Okay, we'll be right back here in a moment with more Candlelight University. Thank you all for staying in there, and welcome back to Candlelight University. We're continuing our discussion on shadow people. Now, Marcus, I know you've done a lot of research into the connection between drug use and shadow people, so would you mind talking a little bit on that?
Yeah, I want to open with saying that I don't think that every story that talks about shadow people is connected to drugs. But I think that it's really important that we talk about it. Here in Evansville, Indiana, we're in Vanderburgh County. And Vanderburgh County has the largest number of convictions of meth labs in the country. And I used to work for the state, and one of the things that we would do is we would have trainings on how to recognize people that were on meth and how to recognize meth labs and all these things. And we used to talk with the police officers that were doing the training, and they would say that people on meth would often talk about seeing the shadow people. and it was very interesting that several people that even were on meth themselves would have conversations about seeing the shadow people, and it was often sort of a secret thing that they wouldn't want to share with other people, just amongst themselves. And when you're on meth and it's altering the dopamine levels in your brain, it can cause hallucinations. And both me and Vic, who've worked in the mental health field, have seen people come in on meth in full blown psychosis, having complete hallucinations. And it makes me question whether or not if every encounter is real, only because I've seen many people that are on meth often talk about trying to turn the TV, turn the channel on the TV, and you can obviously tell there's no TV there. Or they're having conversations with relatives, but there's no relatives there.
What chance do you think there is that there's that idea that's out there, and it's been floated around at least since the '60s, that drug use can open you up to certain dimensions? Now, meth seems like the worst possible drug to do this on, but do you think there might be any sort of connection there with that?
Um,
Also, I'd like to say I do not advocate using meth. Please, guys, don't use meth.
yeah, I think that's a good thing to say, mostly just because I don't know what dimension you're opening yourself up to when you're trying to turn the television in your room. I don't know really what dimension that is. Um, I
But
and
do
I
you
don't.
think there's any chance that they're turning into something, just going someplace very dark and tuning into something very dark?
It could be there. I really do. Um, mostly no, just because often stories in which people are seeing shadow people sometimes even cause them to destroy their furniture because they're looking for something, because they're paranoid, thinking that there's microchips in the chairs. Um, Maybe there's connections where you're opening yourself up with other drugs or other substances, but I just think that with how much meth is connected to people talking about the shadow people, as they say, there may be it may just be hallucinations.
Yeah, and I'm somewhat like you. I believe there might be something to it with some of the other drugs, but man, meth is some nasty, nasty stuff. And take it from us here in Indiana, we have to see it more than we like to admit.
Yeah.
It's just some bad stuff. But what about people going through withdrawal or coming off these sort of drugs? Any connections there?
Well, some people do report seeing shadow people or seeing things even when they're sober, even when they've stopped doing drugs, and not even just meth, any sort of drugs that alters the dopamine level in your brain, whether it's other antipsychotics or LSD or other illicit drugs. Um, One of the things that can happen is you can still have hallucinations once you cut yourself off from that. When one of the things that me and Vic will sometimes see when we work at the hospital is we have to monitor people for detoxing. And one of the things that can happen when you are cut off from these drugs is you can have hallucinations. When I describe the television, I've seen people come in on substances and would hallucinate, thinking they're trying to change the channel of a TV or talk to people. And in the same thing, I've seen people come in fine, and then a few days later start that behavior. A study that I saw out of Japan in 2007, and it was addressing actually meth induced psychosis, talked about people that would still have hallucinations even up to almost 3 months after they were done. And I got to bring that up because when I was reading Darkness Walks, there was a story in which a guy talked about seeing a shadow person, and his response to it, the concept of drugs was, "Oh, I hadn't done drugs that night or drank alcohol that night." Not, "I don't do drugs," not, "I don't drink." It's, "I hadn't done that night." So it just makes me wonder sometimes.
Do you think any of these cases, these entities may be looking for people who are in that sort of mindset, in that sort of desperate situation where they're turning to those sort of drugs and then possibly capitalizing on it?
Yeah, that's true. I do think that sometimes that on the flip side, that using drugs can bring these things into your life. These things tend to be really drawn sometimes to people that are in really bad situations.
They also seem very opportunistic.
They do. Sometimes they even target, it seems, people for other reasons other than just drug use.
Yeah, that's true. I've worked several cases where people were reporting shadow people, but only as a side effect of the greater issue that they're going on with. Having a either dramatic haunting going on or having some other entity in their house, and then also they're reporting we also see shadow people on the borders of the property, or sometimes we'll see shadow peoples outside the window. We were working a case some time back where this family was under assault by a paranormal entity, which some of the people in the house believed was a guardian, but it was more of a oppressive sort of thing. Although this entity was not a shadow person, at the same time, they reported seeing shadow people very often. I feel like these things will sometimes piggyback or be opportunistic. I think they're looking for families that are currently within crisis, whether it be due to drug use, cases of abuse, or even struggling with another paranormal entity. I think they show up to take advantage or capitalize on that.
You can even, I mean, that's not an uncommon idea. I mean, you can see this trait even in people. There's studies that show that where they took women that have been victims of horrible trauma in their lives and put them in a room playing with their kids, and they had a window in between them and another room, and in that room they had men that were brought in that were horrible abusers that committed horrible things to women or other men or other people, and almost 9 times out of 10, in scary statistics, these men could figure out really easily which women had been victims of trauma in the past.
So you think these things might be using a similar sort of lookout strategy, looking for people who will likely fall into an abuse case scenario so they can take control of them?
Yeah, I mean, how many times are you walking down the street and you look at somebody and the first thing in your mind is it looks like they do drugs, or they just look like they have a dark rain cloud following them?
And you think these creatures just might be opportunists in that sort of way where they see an opening and they'll go for it?
I do.
I think that this would be a good chance for us to dive into what some of their motivations might be. What do you think?
I think so. I mean,
well, Marcus, do you think that these things are indies of that are purely negative, or do you think they can be positive?
I think they're neutral at best. I think that when you look at sort of the spectrum of what these things look like, you have shadow animals, you have just people, shadow people that just look like people, up to things that have very exaggerated features where they're really long or they're really, I don't know, sinister looking, up to ones that look like they have hats or clothing, all the way up to glowing eyes. So I mean, it really looks like, and the further that you go along in the spectrum, the more negative these things tend to be. It's like the more you add, the more definition you add to these things, the more negative they look like.
One of the things I've always wondered, and at first let me preface this by saying I believe these to be negative entities. But one of the things that you'll notice if you really dive into a lot of Shadow People reports, they're the ones that just seem to be not interested or perhaps not even capable of noticing us. And then there's the ones that pay special attention to us. I almost wonder if whatever process of life or unlife that they go through, if they start as these more benign sort of entities, and that as they go through, they realize at some portion where they might be able to feed off some of our emotions, take advantage of them, and somehow that gives them some aspect of power or control, and that's where you start to see the more inhuman looking ones popping up, the more red-eyed sort of ones popping up, the ones that stalk people throughout their life. I wonder if they're taking something from this negative emotion that they're causing, and they're able to build themselves into something stronger.
Well, think about it like an infant. The more attention that you give to an infant, the more the more you feed it, and the more that you help it grow, it starts to develop more traits. It learns to talk, it learns to walk, it starts learning to operate on its own. very similar to what these things are. Very similar to what these things seem to do. The more attention that they seem to get from us.
And this isn't the only supernatural entity that people speculate feed off negative emotion.
Oh no.
But at that, I'm not really quite sure exactly what process could possibly lead to that, considering it doesn't really naturally exist in any form of the observable world. But these things are far from being natural beings. And if any of you guys have any thoughts on that, please send them in to us, because we'd love to figure that one out.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps there's something along the lines of demonic-esque sort of entities.
Well, when you look at paranormal researchers that talk about these things, or just other researchers in general that talk about these things possibly being demonic, one of the things that they will say is the devil always has he reveals himself in some way to let you know of what he is. There's some sort of a tell. It's kind of like when you think about like witches, they always had some sort of a trademark, whether it was like sort of warts in their nose or they're abnormally cold or something like that.
I think a better comparison may be some of the stories of the fae folk, which usually would have something off about them to imply that they weren't human.
That is a much better. I will agree with you. That is a much better comparison of what they are. To what they are.
But the question is then, if they are, then are we going with the assumption that they're trying to get something out of us, trying to feed on us for their own gain or something like that?
I think so. I mean,
yeah, I'm pretty strongly on that bandwagon as well. Do you think it's something just for their own personal development, or do you think there might be something more sinister to it?
I mean, if you compare what they do to kind of what people. I mean, people all the time do negative things to people just for laughs or just for giggles.
Actually, that's a good point. Perhaps we're trying to apply too much reason to these sort of creatures.
Maybe they're just rude. Maybe they're just bad people. Maybe they're just bad entities that just do it for the sake of being bad.
I was going to use the term sociopaths, but I think that works too.
We can use your word too. I was being a little more lame in there.
What sort of connections can be drawn to sociopaths and people who engage in abusive relationships like we've talked about before?
These things seem to have no remorse in what they do.
Well, then perhaps they may be what we would generally label as sociopathic.
I mean, I can't think of a single story in which you find one of these things weeping or looking sorrowful for any reason.
I've never heard of one. And that brings up to an interesting possibility. I first heard of this idea on Mysterious Universe with Benjamin Grundy and Aaron Wright. Great guys. If you get a chance, go check out their podcast. But they're talking about the possibility of it being associated with astral projection, that perhaps shadow people are just people currently in an astral projection state looking to take advantage of people, or perhaps not even intending it. In the case that they are talking about, although shadow person didn't particularly come up, they seem to have been implying it. But a man had been astral projecting to visit a woman in the night, and let's just say he didn't have the most honorable ideas to it. He just thought he was lucid dreaming, and that he was just in his own little playground in his mind. Later on, he ran into this woman, and this is by far the short version of it. You should check out their podcast for the full. But later on, that woman runs into him in his day-to-day life, sees him, and just freaks out, takes off running, screaming bloody murder, trying to get away from him. Clearly there is some sort of bleed over. I think they speculated that perhaps she had seen him as a shadow person, or perhaps sensed the same sort of presence.
Well, I mean, if these things are astral projecting, it really seems like it looks like sociopathic people tend to be the ones that tend to be. I've discovered the great way to astral project, because I see very few stories of them ever being helpful.
In all honesty, as interesting as the astral projection idea is, I'd say probably not the most likely one, because then you would probably see less sociopathic sort of aspects going through. You would see behavior that ran a gambit, instead of just being purely negative.
I think it's also worth bringing up, because Jason brought it up in Darkness Walks, a possible theory about what these things are, motivations, that they are lizard people. I don't think that you can have a talk on the paranormal without somebody being absolutely convinced that these are lizard people, these are alien, this is an alien race coming to Earth for sinister reasons against mankind.
Hey, not everybody thinks they're aliens. Some people think they come from the hollow Earth. Not dissing on anyone who believes, it's just, well, it's a little more out there.
I have a real hard time believing this theory, mostly just because it seems that their evidence that shadow people are lizard people is because they're lizard people. Of course, that's what they are. It has to be lizard people. There's no other explanation, and that's their scientific founding. But
I have noticed that the people who are very into reptilians, not dissing you guys as a whole.
No, I'm not. It's just I have not seen the explanation enough for me to be convinced that they're shadow people.
But they do try to seem to tie reptilians into every aspect of the political, paranormal, day-to-day life, church service. Sometimes some of the people who are interested in the subject, I think, take it a little too far and turn everything into lizard people. But let's see. Is there anything else you want to bring up before we got to our break?
I do. I think another thing that often you talked about these things piggybacking off of other things.
Yep.
Something that you saw definitely in Darkness Walks was the concept of the Ouija board and trying to essentially open yourself up and ask, the spirits or whatever entity for things. Now, I'm not dissing on the concept of the Ouija board. Mostly, I have my critiques of it. Mostly just because a lot of times it seems that people are sort of kind of moving it themselves, and sometimes this object is brought to you by Hasbro, who's brought us other great things like the Mr. Potato Head and Play-Doh. But I'm really more kind of concerned about the concept of opening yourself up to something that you don't know what it is.
Well, I mean, the idea of the Ouija board goes back before Hasbro, and it was very common in parlors in the Victorian period. The idea of spirit boards does go back a fair ways, and I personally think there's something to it. And I think when you use one, you do risk opening yourself up to stuff like that.
I do. I don't think that the instructions that you get in one of these things that you buy at your local store, I think prepares you to possibly handle what you might be inviting into your life.
Yeah. Well, anyone who's going to use one, I generally suggest be careful. You're opening up a door. You're not totally sure what's going to walk through.
I would just recommend against it.
No point in being a sourpuss and down the whole thing. It can certainly be a fun evening, but
I don't invite people that I don't know, let alone something I don't even know what it is, into my home. So
I definitely would say at least be wary of it. Know that there are risks associated with it.
Agreed. We can agree on that.
Well, I think that's all for the moment. We'll get you right back after the break, and we'll see you here in a few minutes. Welcome back, and thank you all for hanging in there. We had a story come in from one of our Facebook followers. Marcus, would you mind telling the good people at home about it?
Mm-hmm. Our story comes to us from Adam. He agreed to let us share his story. In June of 2008, Adam and his wife took a tour of Waverly Hills Sanitarium in Louisville, Kentucky. This is a popular paranormal hotspot. Several people report having different paranormal experiences there. Our investigative group is actually planning a trip up there ourselves. So Adam and his wife's tour came to a spot where people had reported seeing shadow people. The tour guide asked if anybody would like to take a walk to the end of the hallway to see if they saw anything. So Adam volunteers to go down, thinking it was all BS. The group stayed about 20 yards behind. He walks to the end of the hallway and turns around. He immediately feels something pass behind him. Before you could tell the group, Adam hears the tour guide and someone else say, "Did you see that?" At this point, he sees a shadowy figure sit down in a chair to his left. He sat down, crossed his legs very briefly, and then stood up and passed behind him. This time it stopped, and he feels a pressure on his right shoulder blade. The guide then begins to tell him to walk back slowly. The tour group became a little weird at this point. All of a sudden, for no reason, he pulls his shirt up from his body, and in the front, he caught his cross necklace falling off. It wasn't broken, the clasp had come undone. At this point, he was pretty freaked out, but didn't want anyone else to notice. As the tour continues, the spot on his shoulder where he felt the pressure begins to burn. When he touches it, it's warm to the touch and developing a whelp. If this isn't unnerving you, after a few minutes, it begins to bleed. At this time, he was overcome by a very uncomfortable feeling. The only way he described it is like when you're in a group of people and you get called out, and pretty much like you're called out or in trouble in front of everybody. After the tour, he speaks with the owners and told them what had happened. They told him it wasn't an uncommon occurrence. They discouraged him from talking about it for fear that it would be bad for business. After seeing the marks that had been left, the owner said that something had attached itself to Adam. It would follow him home. The owner explained that it happens to her all the time. Afterwards, Adam and his wife went out of their car and prayed that whatever happened would stop right there and be done. Of course, as you can probably guess, it doesn't. 15 minutes later, while driving home, Adam's neck all of a sudden begins to burn again. When they investigated Adam's neck, they found there was 4 or 5 scratches going down his neck. Moments later, it happened again, and the scratches went through the existing ones. Shortly afterwards, the owner called and said that there was a priest in the group after theirs and heard about what had happened. He wanted to come to Adam's home and to bless him in his apartment. They said a spirit had attached itself to him. Adam and his wife declined the offer. They chose instead to call one of their friends who was a pastor and sought counsel. As soon as he was over the bridge and back in Indiana, he felt fine. About 2 years later, Adam was heading back towards Cincinnati for work. Somewhere near Louisville, he began feeling sick. He Googled the nearest CVS to get some Pepto, and set his GPS to take him there. The route was off the highway along some back roads. As he was driving, he continues to feel worse. He drives a short while further, and his GPS loses signal. At this point, he pulls into a drive, opened the front door, and threw up. After getting sick, he looks that his GPS had taken him back to the entrance of Waverly.
Well, that's quite a story there.
Yeah. So Vic, did you see any similarities between Adam's story and Shadow People?
Well, there's a lot of telltale signs that relate to many of the Shadow People encounters, particularly the idea of it one to continue to follow and affect them. The mark that was left on, I've also heard of that sort of scratching associated with ghosts as well, particularly the feeling that there's something wrong there, then a burning, followed by the whelps and the bleeding. Did you find any similarities?
Yeah, I noticed that during the story it talked about that his clasp of his cross necklace had come undone, which a lot of times when people describe stories about shadow people and they try to, I don't know, rebuke them or cast them away using either holy water or praying, that they often become either they disappear or they become angered, like it seems to bother them.
Yeah, it's one of the ways that's commonly reported to be able to break out of a Shadow People encounter that involves paralysis is to begin to pray to yourself. But yeah, I just wanted to talk about the cross as well. Some of my thoughts on that one is the reasons it might have wanted to get rid of the cross would be the cross is a protective symbol. It may have been trying to remove that from him to make stronger contact. Another possibility would be that we've made a lot of connections before between Shadow People and abusive relationships. It may have been trying to separate himself from one of his supports. What do you think?
I agree. I mean, when you read the story, it talks about it at one point he becomes very uncomfortable. He said he described when you're in a group of people and you get called out or you're in trouble in front of everybody. That isolative and loneliness feeling that abusers often like to do to their victims.
We keep crossing those same sort of parallels between abuse and these sort of creatures.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Vic, how do you think that it was able to know that he was nearby, maybe towards the end of the story?
Well, I'd say most likely when it left the physical mark, it also left a spiritual mark that it was able to track him by. It's like a sort of psychic or paranormal brand. It would likely know if it was near or if he was nearby and was able to track his movements. What I found more interesting was that it stopped around the river. Some people discuss water as being a cleansing element that some supernatural creatures can't cross. Also, the bridge is a large metal one, and there are certain metals that are supposed to be able to prevent paranormal creatures from crossing through.
The only objection that I may give to that argument is if anybody who lives by the Ohio River knows everything that's been dumped into it, I don't know how much of a cleansing agent that Ohio River really is. Yeah, if you've heard our PSA announcement on meth. This is our PSA announcement. Don't swim in the Ohio
Oh,
River.
for the love of God, don't swim the Ohio River.
Yeah, this is the next one.
And that's a good point. It's a pretty polluted body of water, but maybe its physical corruption doesn't affect its spiritual cleansing. But that's a theory for another day.
Yeah, but I mean, this is also an instance in which there were scratches left by, and I remember reading Darkness Walks, and like we said, there's several passages in there and several different stories. Um, Not a lot of them talk about actually these things leaving marks.
Yeah, this is not something I've commonly heard about shadow people myself in the past. This would be the first case I've heard of a shadow people a shadow person leaving an actual mark on someone. But like I said, I've heard of this in other paranormal cases, though.
But one of the things that we did talk about was he said that the more attention that these things seem to get, the more powerful they tend to get. And anybody who in the paranormal and anybody who's into the paranormal know Waverly Hills in Louisville is a heavily sought after, spot to go and visit. I mean, these things get attention all the time from people.
Yeah, it's supposedly a very heavily charged spot. I've even heard sensitives and psychics saying that it's charged with psychic energy.
Which might explain why you might see an encounter that might actually turn hostile.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if there's a place for that to happen, I'd say Waverly Zoo would be a good spot for it.
Yeah.
What are your final thoughts on it all?
I think that shadow people are a very troubling entity. With most paranormal entities, they actually have defining features that let you see what they are and generally knowing what you're looking at.
I think it's important when discussing them to re-emphasize all the parallels we've drawn today with abusive relationships. I think that pretty much sums up my thoughts on it right there.
Yeah.
That these are things that are interested in themselves. They're not interested in you and whatever they're going to do. I think so for their own self-interest.
Yeah. I mean, these things just seem just out to inflict so much fear on people. And they really can do that because with such a lack of form and clear definition, when you read about them, there are so many different speculations on what they are and what they're after. And it reminds me a lot of the story of Helen of Troy and from Homer, because he described her as this very beautiful woman, but he never describes what her features are. He only describes her as a woman that instills so much lust in older men that have not felt lust for a very long time. So it leaves your imagination to picture the most beautiful woman you can think of. And when you look at shadow people and such a lack of definition and you try to make sense of what they are, the only thing that you can do a lot of times is come to the worst conclusion that you can.
A paranormal blank canvas for us to project our own fears upon.
And that's why they are so troubling to me and so concerning.
I think the one big remaining question I have from all this is, like we talked about earlier, some shadow people seem to be benign, just almost tracing back over the same actions repeatedly, not really going out for anything on their own. What makes those so benign and others so aggressive? What's the line they cross that makes them so interested in us? I guess we're going to have to wait on an answer for that one. If any of you back at home have any ideas on that one, please send it in to us.
At this point, we just want to give a great thank you to the writer of Darkness Walks, Jason, for helping us give a lot of better understanding of shadow people. I want to give a great thank you to Adam for letting us share his story.
And I want to give a big shout out to Aaron Wright and Benjamin Grundy of Mysterious Universe for inspiring us to make our own podcast.
If you guys liked our podcast today, please like it, leave your comments on your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel.
And we'll be seeing you all again soon.